Добрый день, коллеги. Мы сегодня продолжаем.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So here we are with yet another event, part of our series called CDO Today. Well, it's a big world and there's a lot of transformation in the world, and we have all the greatest and latest about CDO world. And we're talking about data, very, very important topic. Well, in Russia, as you know, we're used to the fact that this is always on top of our agenda, all sorts of sanctions, limitations, but we're not the only ones, of course. Many, many other countries and the general global community, Europe, the United States, and others, well, are adopting very, very important policies such as GDPR, privacy acts that install certain limitations of what you can do, of what you cannot do. But despite that, despite the fact that, well, some say that Europe is quite conservative, but it's actually turning around and it's trying to convert itself into something that is going to be at the forefront of the whole digital innovation. So, and in line with that, we are seeing very, very exciting policies and government innovations, such as creating one single European data space and opening up the market not only for the government but also for the private sector. You can find the details on the EU official website. And you can find a lot of details about the new type of regulations that is here to stay and come. So we're going to take it from the horse's mouth. We're going to have some incredible experts today, and we're going to talk about the roles, responsibilities, the outlook, the scenarios, how it's going to play out, and of course, we're talking about the government and the business. So we need to pinpoint the strategy for Russia as well. Should we copy paste European experience? Should we find our own way? What is the right way to go for us? What kind of experience can we copy into Russia? And how can we harmonize our approach? Can we do something in Russia the way they did it in Europe so that we can actually leapfrog and become a leading country? And of course, this kind of dialogue is always cross functional because this goes well beyond Russia, and that's why we have incredible European experts. So I think our EU experts we have really, really profound knowledge here in the room. These are experts that have been doing this for years. And despite the political limitations and sanctions, we're still people and we still talk and we still learn from each other. It is very, very important that this dialogue goes on. So thank you, our European friends, for being with us today and sharing your knowledge. We truly, truly appreciate it. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. And we, of course, going to start with the European part. And we have here today the ambassador of the European Union in Russia, Marcus Ederer. Marcus, very warm welcome to you. Up next, we have our European data expert for European Commission, Shimon Lewandowski. Shimon, hello as well. And of course, we also have managing partner for Dentons, Victor Naumov. Victor, hello to you as well. Thank you for being with us today. And of course, we also have the government representatives here today. We have Roskomnadzor, First Deputy Chairman, Miloš Wagner. Welcome. We also have Head of Legal Department from the Ministry of Digital Development, Roman Kuznetsov. And we also have Deputy Head of Ministry of Economic Development, Mr. Fedulov as well. So thank you, Vladislav. And we have the business community, Anna Serebryannikova, President for Big Data Association of Russia, Boris Rabinovich, Senior Vice President for Sberbank Data Management Department, and Alexander Krainov, Head of Machine Learning Laboratory at Yandex. So without further ado, let's jump in, and let me start with the ambassador, of course, because we know that the tech giants like Apple, Google, Facebook, and the like, well, they are putting more and more pressure, and they affect the governments, the whole world, and they are so strong that there's no way to hide from them, and they actually sometimes being part of political processes. The first question to you, sir, in your mind, what should be the strategy? What exactly should we do with regards to these tech giants? Do we regulate? What is the strategy? What are the options here? So, and as part of the European Union, what exactly are you doing? I know you're building the single European data space, and I guess you also bearing in mind the position of this tech giant. So, the topic we're talking about today, will it maybe create an analogy like a European Google? Is it even possible? Please, sir.
Well, thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thanks for having me and my colleague Simon from Brussels. Obviously, I'm talking to you from Moscow. And just to say that I want to express my gratitude to the organizers. I know Digital Economy for taking this initiative, listening also to the EU voice. I think it's extremely important that we have an exchange on these issues as we are adopting our strategies, and ideally they will be compatible with each other in order to create safe digital data flows. Living here, I must say I'm impressed by the level at which Russian digital companies work. I'm meeting here with high representatives of Sber, of Yandex, Wildberries, and I think this what happens here is important for us, not only because these companies also have plans to move to Europe. It is important to us to compare notes as we have to look at what's happening across the Atlantic. You mentioned the big internet platforms. And there is one question which comes up across the board. It is, what's the way we handle data? Given their importance in the economic life across sectors and well beyond, as you have already mentioned. Therefore, it's important that our civil societies, including our business communities, relate, have exchanges, but also our public authorities, just to say that, despite the issues we may have, we do have these technical exchanges. Not long ago, we had an exchange between Roskomnadzor and the European Commission, DG Justice, on personal data, and we are also looking forward to another exchange between DG Connect, which Simon represents here today, and the Ministry of Digital Economy, Digital Development in the next weeks. It's a truism now that COVID-19 has accelerated and highlighted the digitalization of the society and the economy, and we're talking about everything across the board: business, administrative services, education, healthcare, cultural, creative activities, communications. They all depend on connectivity and digital assets to continue functioning. And we are also very clear in Europe that COVID, maybe more than before, has exposed our dependence on technologies coming from other parts of the world, provided by big online platforms, which you have mentioned, and we need to act. That's very clear. So in view of this, and you asked me about the strategy, I will say a few general words about the strategy. Simon will be in a much better position to give you more explanations and more in detail. But just to say that the European Commission adopted a strategy for data that relies on a mix of policy measures, including new legislation and also substantial funding for research and innovation. The strategy includes new initiatives on data governance and on fair and trustworthy digital market practices, so that EU citizens and companies operating in the EU should be able to rely on EU levels of data protection and security. The Data Governance Act consists of three main distinct elements. First, data held by public bodies. We want to enable the possibility to tap into those data that are currently not shared because they are sensitive. They're sensitive because they concern someone's rights, and those rights could, for instance, be on intellectual property rights, commercial confidentiality, or privacy. With the new rules, such data can now be shared. They can be made available for reuse because the level of legitimate protection will be maintained, even if they travel to other countries. Second, to facilitate data sharing, we are creating principles for trustworthy intermediaries that will provide the basic infrastructure for data spaces. The principle behind the intermediaries is to boost voluntary data sharing whilst preserving control over the data from companies and individuals. This will only work if those intermediaries are fully trusted, obviously. And therefore, several caveats will have to ensure this trust. To start with, such intermediaries are required to notify the competent public authority of their intention to provide data sharing services and they will ensure the protection of sensitive and confidential data. And they will have to comply with strict requirements to ensure their neutrality. In practice, that means that data intermediaries will function as a neutral, and I underline a neutral third party that connects data holders and data users. Framework offers an alternative model, as you now understand, to the current data handling practices offered by the big tech platforms. Public bodies and companies will only be ready to share data if they are certain that their data will not be used by data sharing service providers for any other purposes than those which had been agreed upon before. And this is all about providing a safe environment for those willing to share data. And the third and last element of the Data Governance Act is that these principles also apply to us individuals whenever we wish to share our own personal data or donate them to serve for a more general public or medical or any other, say, public interest. For instance, people suffering from rare diseases may voluntarily share the data of their medical tests to be used to improve treatments for those diseases, but obviously you need to protect the personal part of the data. So new so-called personal data spaces will ensure that people can keep control over their own data, and the personal data spaces also ensure that they are only used for purposes agreed to. In this case, which I just mentioned, this example, it would be for medical research. So this new regulation will therefore provide a governance framework that will ensure that data can be made available voluntarily by data holders and support common European data spaces. It will also allow businesses, small and big, to benefit from easier access to data and from reduction in both costs and time in acquiring data. Let me conclude with a word on what this means for the EU-Russia relationship and also come back to one of your questions. I mean, for us, not only in the field of digital economy, we believe that competitiveness comes from openness, and for the digital economy, we would say that it's even more true for data. We are not erecting barriers to oppose the GAFAs, as they are called in an acronym. We want to organize the rules of the game such that all companies will be given a fair share and a fair chance in the EU digital ecosystem. Whether this then will be conducive to creating what you call the European Google remains to be seen, but you know, creating a level playing field certainly is more conducive to the growth of competitors to the big data companies than what we see now. And I believe it's important also for EU-Russia relations. We have to keep our borders open to the point possible, and also to the mutual benefit of our digital sectors on both sides, but also across sectors as they increasingly rely on data and digital tools. I should say that we follow with concerns developments that aim at cutting the Russian economy from important resources provided by foreign and, for this purpose, EU companies, such as efforts to localize softwares, as well as imposing VAT on foreign companies while it remains waived for local companies. Again, we believe that openness is the best recipe for competitiveness and also for everybody having access to the best available technology. Now, to thank you again, let me say that we are confident that the European data space can thrive in full respect of European principles and rules, such as personal data protection, consumer protection, and competition rules. In this way, we believe that Europe's data governance will become a viable alternative to the current model, which you have described, being dominated by big data providers and processors, dominated by the big tech platforms, mostly from the United States, but of course increasingly from China. I would thank you very much for your attention and for your readiness to invite us and to listen to us. And I'm myself looking forward to what Simon has to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Absolutely. So we have Szymon Lewandowski, European Commission expert that has direct influence and direct involvement into this initiative. So, and he will join us momentarily. And let me just point out and maybe ask Szymon to talk a little bit more about these intermediaries, because when it comes to data exchange, especially when it comes to personal data and also other type of data, is quite limited. And any transmission of data is also limited, not just because of the Personal Data Act in Russia, but also a litany of other, limitations that do not provide for this free exchange of data. So this whole idea of creating that, data space and this intermediary idea, it's a very, very new idea for Russia because we don't have anything like that. And so maybe, Szymon, you can actually give us more details about that in your presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and for the possibility to say a couple of words about the recent European initiatives on data governance and on implementing data strategy in general. I've prepared a couple of slides to guide you through the latest, I would say, interesting initiative in that area, which is the Data Governance Act, and which, when adopted, would regulate to a certain extent data sharing for all EU member states. I represent the DG Connect, which is a service of the European Commission that deals with digitization of the economy, with all matters, including data policy and innovation. Let me maybe start with just explaining why we think we need a certain regulation for data governance right now. Could you please switch to the next slide? So, in fact, after talking to many stakeholders active in the data economy, many companies that share data or would like to share data and use data in Europe, well, we noticed that there is a certain need for an alternative to the current business models around data, and a certain need for change in the way the data is governed across sectors. And that is linked to the fact that currently we see certain bottlenecks, we see certain problems and obstacles arising which hamper the growth of the data economy. And that is related to the rather high transaction costs, which means that when companies want to engage in exchange of data, they notice that there are certain obstacles of technological nature, including standards, lack of interoperability. There are certain legal problems related to, I would say, certain clarity around the rules that apply, and a general lack of trust. So a lack of confidence in the current models, in the current platforms, in the current services for data sharing, where data holders are often afraid that once they open up their data to someone else, the data could be misused, or they would lose their competitive advantage. Another issue that we see is an insufficient availability of data for reuse, which is a paradox because we have more and more data being produced on a daily basis, but only a portion of that data is actually made available for another entity to use. And that is obviously a huge loss of potential and a huge loss of value which sits in that data. And then resulting from this is something which is typically European, which is a problem that when we have a market failure, when the market cannot itself easily solve a problem, different member states of the European Union may try to solve this issue in their own way. And that is a problem for the internal market. So there's an issue which is a regulatory fragmentation, whereas obviously the aim for us is to have a single market for data, just like we already have a single market for goods and services. Could I ask for the next slide? Therefore, We have a strategy to support the growth of the data economy in Europe, and one of its key elements is the Data Governance Act proposal, in which we try to tackle the following four elements, which have already been outlined before, so I will not stay too long on each of them, but just to say that we think we need a new model for data intermediaries to share data in the single market. We want to encourage individuals and companies to voluntarily give at the disposal of the public sector, for instance, or to researchers, to innovators, their data, to donate their data in the form of data altruism. We would like to open up more public sector information, which is held by the administration and which currently is not exploited because of certain limitations and sensitivity of that data. And we would like to have a better coordination in terms of standards, in terms of interoperability, in terms of promoting best practices across different sectors in Europe through the creation of the Data Innovation Board. And quite importantly, I think, whereas the whole strategy on data and this Data Governance Act looks at both personal data and non-personal data, we think that actually there is a certain new opportunity opening up for Europe, which is related to this wealth of non-personal data created by machines, created by sensors in Internet of Things environments, in the industry. And it's particularly that data they would like, the value of this data that we would like to harness for the coming decade. And this is why we think it's a right moment to put in place basic elements, basic building blocks for data governance in Europe, because there's this new wave of data which is coming up and it's gaining in importance. Next slide, please. So the data sharing intermediaries, I think, is the most interesting element of this legislation that we have proposed. And here the aim is to make sure that we have rules for services which enable data holders to monetize on their data by the use of this data by third parties, innovators, companies. So the idea is to make sure that those who keep the data, those who generate the data, both individuals and companies, can find a safe, trustable, reliable service which would help them overcome these legal, technical, and trust obstacles that I have discussed before, and would find someone or a company usually that would be willing to do something interesting with the data and allowing data holders to actually monetize the value of their data. The point is that we have currently different services such as data brokerage services, which normally aggregate the data from different data producers. They transform the data, they add value, and they usually generate a data based service, which then they sell on for their own benefit. But we'd like to see, and we like to support the emergence of data intermediaries, as we call it, European style, which would need to be neutral and whose role would be to link the different clients, different stakeholders in the data economy. So to match the demand for data with the supply of data. And whereas themselves, they could only provide the technical infrastructure, they could solve the technical issues related to interoperability, but they would not treat the data as an asset for themselves. The control over the data and the value generated through this data would be purely allocated to the data generators, to the data holders, not the data sharing platform itself. So that would be a kind of an alternative to the current way of sharing data through the big platforms, I would say. And it really responds to the kind of requests that we have been receiving and the evidence that we have gathered from different companies active in the data economy. We see platforms that already, to a large extent, comply with what we want to have. Companies which are quoted in the slide, such as Dawex in France, or Databroker in Belgium. But we would like to boost this evolution, to have more of such platforms coming up in different sectors across Europe, and by including an obligation of notification for these data sharing services, we would also increase the trust, because it would be there would be a sort of a seal of approval from a competent state authority that would give the users of such services reassurance that their data is not going to be misused, is not going to be used against their competitive position, and it's going to be only used according to the conditions that have previously been agreed. Currently, this is a big problem in the data economy that we see in Europe, which is holding it back. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, apart from the sharing mechanism that we want to see harmonized and reinforced across Europe, we think there is a lot of potential for data to be actually donated without any direct reward. So, instances where data, especially huge quantities of data, like pan-European data sets coming from different member states, could be used for the benefit of research, for the benefit of innovation. Of course, we can imagine pharmaceutical companies, we can imagine health research, we can imagine environmental concerns, all kind of objectives of general interest could really benefit from us, citizens, but also companies giving away some of their data to be analyzed, to be pooled and processed for the common good. And for that, we foresee a procedure of voluntary registration, a kind of a label, which is called Data Altruism Organization Recognizing the Union. Let's imagine a kind of institution or organization like a Red Cross or some other notable charity, which is specifically focusing on data and enabling data donation. We think that this is a good idea, a complementary way to increase data sharing in Europe. And as we know, data is a major asset of the digital economy. So we have to do everything we can to release the potential of data for both the economy and business and the society and the common good. Next slide, please. This is linked, of course, to the fact that there's a lot of data held by the public sector, and this data has a lot of potential and a lot of value. We already have an open data directive, which is a legal framework that basically includes what we call a right to reuse, meaning that as a principle, everybody in Europe, all companies and all citizens have a right to request information held by the state, and save for very particular exceptions and exclusions, most of the data held by the government has to be made reusable upon request or proactively online. But some datasets cannot be easily exploited. Some of these datasets cannot be simply published online, and that is mostly because they are covered by some sort of limitation, such as personal data protection, such as third-party intellectual property rights or trade secrets. And we think it's a shame, because there are many registers, many databases held by the public sector which could be exploitable, which could be made usable. And therefore we have put in place certain rules to, I would say, extend the best practices that we have seen across Europe in countries like France or Germany or Finland, where there are specific bodies and specific processes that have been put in place to enable safe processing of, for instance, personal data sets for the benefit of science or for the benefit of innovation. And this is the kind of model that we would like to extend across Europe. We would also like to make it easier for companies to actually learn about this kind of data, which is available to them. So there is a one contact point, a single information point for each member state that's going to be set up, which would give all the necessary information, which sensitive data is available, under which conditions it can be used. Can it be used outside of the public sector or in a secure digital environment, for instance, like is the case for most of health data or microstatistics, for instance. So again, opening up more valuable data from the public sector is something that we think could really power up the digital economy in Europe. Next slide, please. Oops. Yes, the Data Innovation Board is, well, let's say the final chapter of this new legislation that we think is again needed, because if we have to handle 27 member states, we have to somehow organize this data governance across Europe. We need a common entity, a common platform to make it easier for those different sectors that are concerned, for instance, to adopt the best practices, to adopt the most suitable standards, and to basically facilitate the cooperation of different national authorities that are competent in that area. That would have a form of an expert group working very closely with the Commission, and we have seen similar solutions being adopted in other fields. We think it can be a very useful solution to give recommendations and guidance and basically guide the evolution of data governance on the European scale. Next slide, please. This slide is to show, I would say, the general approach of the European Commission as to the evolution and as to what we should be doing with regards to the data economy. And the point is that on the top European level, we want to bring in some basic building blocks of data governance, such as through legislation, including the Data Governance Act, but of course, other legislation such as the General Data Protection Regulation or the Open Data Directive are also key building blocks for this governance. However, the data economy itself needs to be driven by the stakeholders themselves, by voluntary data sharing. And this sort of voluntary data sharing will most likely start at the level of individual sectors, such as health, finance, energy, etc. So we are aiming at facilitating this sort of sectoral intensification of data sharing. This is what we call data spaces, those thematic or sectoral data spaces. And apart from the legislation, of course, we will also give a lot of financial support to make sure that such data spaces start operating, that they have the capacity to grow. In some sectors, we could already speak of very, very first data spaces emerging on their own. In some sectors, we probably need to be a bit more assertive and push a little bit more. But overall, this is the idea. The data spaces will grow at a different different pace, different speed. But overall, they will contribute to the creation of the common goal, which is the European single data space. And last slide, please. This, I'd like to finish with a quote by our commissioner, Mr. Thierry Breton, who is responsible for the internal market policy, including digitalization of the economy, including the data economy. And I think this is a very significant quote because it shows the approach that we want to have in this commission to data. And that is to say that we would like to ensure that the value created by European companies from the data of different European companies, different assets, including data coming from individuals, that this value stays in Europe. So this has not always been the case due to the development of the global data economy that we all know, and due to the fact that those big platforms play a strategic role, I would say, a gatekeeper position. But let's say from now on, we'll try to be a bit more assertive and a bit more focused on generating and on keeping the value of data inside Europe. I would just like to finalize with the last slide. If you could move on to the very last slide, which is to encourage you to check out the information that is hosted on the European Commission's website, both in relation to the Data Governance Act and in relation to the general data policy and data strategy. Of course, it's all updated. I think it can be quite interesting if you have an interest in what Europe is doing and is about to do in the area of data economy and digitization of economy in general. Please visit our websites. Thank you once again for this opportunity to speak and to outline this, I think, major step in the building of European data governance.
Thank you very much, Shimon. And let's not forget that we're actually webcasting it live via YouTube, and we have a lot of questions on YouTube. And I'm sure, of course, we'll come back to the Q&A. Because we're just getting started. This is a very exciting initiative, and everybody's wondering, and there's so many questions, of course. But we'll definitely come back to it. So let me, by the way, take two of the most pressing questions that came from online viewers. So the first one is about the legal component, which is the intermediaries. What kind of legal form? I mean, are they quasi-government, or can they be totally private? Just how independent are intermediaries from the government? So the first one. And the second one, these altruistic intermediaries, what are their stimulus? Is it like a code of ethic? What will enable their existence? Because the function that they perform are capital intensive. It's not a free lunch. So what is their rationale?
Yes, so the first question, in our view, the data intermediaries, as we plan them, they should actually be commercial entities, because we already see that many such companies exist, perhaps nowadays on a rather smaller scale that we would wish to see, but they already exist. So the market is filling up that gap. And so this is really the aim, to empower fully commercial and completely independent entities to manage data on behalf of their clients. There's a notification procedure foreseen just in order to make sure that there is a certain oversight of the competent authorities, so authorities that are competent in data topics, but there is no steering, no control, no state capital which is supposed to be involved in the functioning of such entities. They can be fully market-based, and the idea is simply to give them a little bit more of recognition through the notification process to ensure trust in their operation, and that's all. And as regards the data altruism entities, well, of course, it can be resource intensive to handle the data. Let's say pulling the data, especially from different member states. and doing it in a non-profit setting. But we have heard from different NGOs, for instance, that would like to enhance their activities to that sort of field, and to intermediate in a way in pulling and helping research, for instance, based on data. We can imagine that it could be done by let's say specialized parts of already existing organizations, be it big charities or universities or research institutes. They could somehow extend their activities into the field of data altruism, and they shouldn't be funded from, let's say, from the side of the users of that service, meaning the data holders, because the whole concept is that it should be non-profit. It should be data donation for an altruistic purpose. But how exactly they finance their work is something that they can regulate themselves. The Data Governance Act puts in place certain rules to ensure that the data, especially the personal data, is handled safely. So they have to abide by a certain set of rules. Of course, we already have the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a pretty robust regulation on personal data. In addition to that, there are a couple of conditions they have to meet under this new legislation, but we do not mandate, let's say, the organizational structure or how they should be funded.
Thank you very much for that answer, Shimon. And, I think that we need to move on from the European one, from the European experience, to actually have Victor Naumov, who is a global company representative, not just European, but global. So, Victor, you're an expert. So tell me, can we say that Europe has some exclusivity in terms of the regulatory initiative? Because I've heard that something similar is done in Australia. And maybe there are other countries that are also thinking in similar terms. So can you please comment on that? I was just wondering, just how widespread is this idea, this kind of mindset? Is it like super novelty, or is there more and more of it? Just tell me. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Dmitry. Hello, everyone. So, so should I share the slides or you will share the slides? Okay. No, sure, you can do it. You can do it. It's much easier. Okay, thank you. So I represent Dentons. I'm a managing partner from Dentons, and this is an international company. So let me give you a global perspective. Well, the topic is very, very exciting. And true, many countries in the world are dealing with it. And what's happening in the European Union is really what we call best practice. And Mr. Ambassador and Mr. Lewandowski have given us a very comprehensive view of how it will work. They've given us all the key ingredients of what's to come. Well, that said, let me point out the fact that when it comes to developing a government policy, and look, it's not a new thing. I mean, countries around the world have been trying to tackle this issue for years and years. And it's a very important topic, so no wonder governments have been trying to break that code, right? And to find their secret sauce. And because of the pandemic, of course, it accelerates because we're becoming more and more digital, and definitely this area becomes more and more critical. And what's happening at the moment, well, cannot be explained as already set in stone. This is not a set in stone. We cannot say that, hey, this is the holy grail. Like the EU is the way to go. That way or no way. No, it's still a work in progress because there are all sorts of developments. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of trial and error. And as far as the overall field, it's a very wide field. And I guess this is just an intro, of course, to my presentation. because we had very good presentations from the ambassador and Mr. Lewandowski. But in my presentation, I would focus on areas and regions where government is trying to find, well, ways, I would say, to manage data. Oh, that said, if you look at this whole topic, ideally, potentially, in the future, we need to have a system that has a balance of interests. And when it comes to the balance of interests and the balance of powers, well, there's so many ingredients to it. Well, because this, of course, there's the government versus private sector. That's one balance sheet. And it's been here for ages, right? It's a very tough and a very complex dialogue. That's what we've always been trying to tackle, because there's the government and its control, and there's the civil society, and there's also businesses. And every stakeholder wants to protect their own turf, so to say. We know that. And since, well, the end of the 20th century, because of the globalization, we're now also thinking about the single data space, such as internet, the World Wide Web, right? Because, well, it's a global thing. And during this digital transformation, when the protocols and the technology standards are providing seamless data transmission, well, take social networks or World Wide Web, and it's all very, very cheap. Of course, when it comes to who keeps data where and processes this data, this becomes very, very important, because there's so many data and they flow all over the place. There's one more thing, by the way, when it comes to the governments around the world, because here, I mean, for the past maybe 10 or 15 years, we have this brand new marketplace, these new stakeholders. Let's call them internet governments. Let's call it that way. Social networks like Facebook, they're so big and they have so many subscribers that they're quite comparable to governments, to actually countries. And because they're so popular and they have such a loyal audience, that means that they can influence not only locally, but globally. So it's a very intricate, play, and to find that equilibrium so that we can manage and control data, well, that's a very difficult thing to tackle. That said, let's go back to the previous experience and let's have a look at the presentation. And this whole data area is very, very vast. And from a legal standpoint, there are so many different attributes. Well, of course, there's such thing as personal data. There's also the so-called public data. There's big data. There's industrial data. And there are different regulations, right, that try to tackle all these areas. So all sorts of data, personal, non-personal, so lots of ways to classify data. And these are very, very big pools. And you can find some success stories in each and every one of them. That said, when it comes to the policy, when it comes to big data management, and everybody talks about the big data management, well, you don't see any holistic end-to-end approach anywhere in the world that can effectively and efficiently manage all of these types of data at the same time, right? And make sure that nobody's rights or responsibilities are infringed upon. You can call it a very fragmented, very patchy field. There's lots of different regulations. It's a very fragmented space, and there's no holistic approach. That said, when it comes to, well, let's say the European Union, for example, I would say that historically, there's been, of course, government initiatives, the so-called public sector information, and there's been all sorts of stimulus provided from the government to the private sector. And there are two big areas. There's the government and its initiatives, right, when it comes to opening up data, and there's also measures to stimulate all sorts of, well, government data. But governments have always been historically, trying to, I would say, opening up the data in principle. Every government at least declares that they want to have a comprehensive approach to opening up data. So that's always been the ambition. I mean, you can see it from the slide. So back in 2019, OECD, I think, did a survey on enhancing access to and sharing of data. So, and then you can see it right there. So there's lots of issues related to data and, opening up access to public sector. Well, 65% of all initiatives. Well, and there's also lots of private initiatives. But okay, let's look at the PSI situation, like some of the milestone initiatives. Well, for Canada, for example, the Open Government Portal 2014. So the Canada had very, very exciting project, I would say, right, about the single access to data. Mexico, by the way, had this open data initiative as well in 2015. And the idea is to make sure that all public data are open to citizens. That's another initiative, right? And it's a very strong initiative, by the way, very well developed. Now, when it comes to simplifying data exchange in public space, Israel, for example, had this only once policy. Again, to make sure that the government services can be easily provided. And China, in 2018, created this National Center for Data Management. And China tried to be very, very comprehensive here, right? Trying to cover as much space as possible. So anyways, we have stakeholders, and the idea here is that both individuals and companies will now have, additional access. They can get additional access to data, data becoming more available. But again, maybe that's not enough. Okay, we also have, I think, Australia in this regard as a continuation of what European Union is doing. There's the new era, and I think that if it continues, and it will continue, of course, you can see some really great case studies in terms of a well-balanced, I would say a perfectly balanced government policy, such as Australia, for example, the Data Availability and Transparency Bill. And this is indeed a very, very advanced approach from Australia. So, and again, you can call it a sort of a competition. The EU versus Australia versus the United States versus whoever, they all trying to get that secret sauce, that best possible approach. And this is a very exciting initiative from Australia. And of course, kudos to them, continued success. And like I said, I see that is the Australia initiative alongside the European initiative can be the benchmark, as we call it, the benchmark when it comes to using data. So I would look at both EU approach and Australian approach. As a matter of fact, there's so many different approaches here. Well, there's a lot of specialized initiatives, such as the National Strategy for Data in the UK. Right, they're focusing on specific mechanisms of data dissemination, such as the data trusts, specifically for the artificial intelligence. And there's also the Japanese experience called the Act on the Advancement of Public and Private Sector, or Norway, for example. So there are many, many countries that are doing all sorts of specialty approaches, and all of them require tremendous amount of data, and this seamless access. If there's no seamless access, then you can say that you can call it a failure, potentially, right? And any idea should be based on seamless access. Every time there's a block, you can say that the idea is failing, right? So Japan is doing a lot. I would say, and that's a 2016 initiative. I think it's a very, very good example from Japan. It's a very, very holistic, very comprehensive, very thorough approach, I would say, both in terms of anonymous and personal information. Again, it's all about striking the balance. So Japan tried to build a system to meet all stakeholders in the middle, to make sure the data is available, but at the same time, no rights are violated. And they're doing it through anonymous data. and Japan is very good at that. And the way the data becomes anonymous so that it's not causing any threat when the data is being used, right? So anyone who donates the data will not suffer by donating the data. Because sometimes, we say that they make data anonymous, but somehow still the data can hurt the original source, the individual. Okay, so let's look at personal data and big data in the world. We have Russia, Europe, the United States, and China. I would say that bit by bit across the world, we see crystallizing approaches. I mean, the way governments treat this whole situation. Different ways, different approaches. For example, the United States has been very sectoral, right? China, of course, Communist Party trying to install that and maintain that holistic control. Europe trying to create that unified approach. And Russia, since 2006, hasn't done anything pretty much. It doesn't take into account any digital trends, and there's no big data regulation. So Russia, I would say, is far behind here in terms of its approach. I mean, there are some successful case studies around the world in specific sectors, right? You can say that there's, a lot of successful cases, but still room to grow. I'm absolutely sure that definitely all of that is not enough. Good initiatives, but not big enough. And like I said, the perfect solution can come from anywhere, right? This can be European solution, United States, China, whoever. You never know. It's a competition. So it's a competition. So still, the story is being written, so to say. Now, speaking of Japan, I would say Japan has probably the most exciting experience when it comes to using anonymous data. Probably the most balanced in terms of technology and regulation. So because they've given us the most comprehensive approach to using all sorts of data and making it safe. That's the point. From emails to phone numbers to SMS to whatever. So all of that can be used as identifiers and at the same time made safe and anonymous. And if you look at what's been happening in Japan recently, I would say it is something that everyone should at least be aware of and learn from. So Japan did a very, very good job in this. So just to wrap it up, of course, it's a very exciting area and a very comprehensive one. And I would say from a legal standpoint, the biggest problem here is, I would say, the nature and the current geopolitical landscape that we have, unfortunately. Well, first of all, what about the actual jurisdiction? Where is the borderline? How do we settle the border issue for digital and online services? The so-called exterritoriality, right, or the so-called transnational data ecosystem. Because we have all these super powerful tech giants that are global, infinite, have the best and the latest technologies that offer these incredible services that are so popular around the world. And these ecosystems, true, have an incredible, powerful influence on the whole world, on the whole data space. And these are not components of the international legal space, but that said, I mean, because they're so big and so powerful, we have to respect them and learn from them and see what's coming from them. That's the first thing. Second one is the antitrust, anti-monopoly regulation when it comes to data storage and data processing. When it comes to competition, and because the antitrust regulation is about making sure that there's fair competition and that there's always a risk for unfair competition. Of course, speaking of big tech, when you become a quasi-monopoly, you always run a risk of hoarding data or abusing the market, right? And that's why antitrust regulation is important. But it has to be done smartly, of course, and wisely. The third one is access to identification and digital profiles. And digital economy has to deal with the digital trail, digital profiles, and identification. These are both government and private. And a lot of that can be done through self-regulation, such as you can have like a consortium of technology companies that create standards when it comes to digital profiles and identification systems. Because anyone who is part of the digital space has a digital profile, and the question is who and on what terms will provide this kind of access to digital profiles. And this one is not so much about the government, but mostly private digital accounts and profiles. But as part of the government regulation, we need to also think about the identification system and access to digital profiles, which is a very difficult area to tackle. And the last one, last but not least, very difficult one, I would say, is something that's been gaining and becoming very popular in the past 10 years. The so-called privacy, right? Confidentiality. Just how important it is, the secrecy mode, the confidentiality mode, whatever you want to call it, for different types of data. Because on the one hand, you say transparency, fair competition, let's protect the rights of the citizen. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we kind of want to kill two birds with the same stone, because we want public good, but at the same time we want to protect the people that constitute that public good. We want to do both. But let's take the pandemic, for example, right? And the pandemic is still there, and I still believe that the full effect of the pandemic is not yet produced itself when it comes to privacy, data, and whatnot. It's still chapter 1. So here, when it comes to making sure that the data is relatively available, become easy to get, so you need to liberalize privacy legislation. But on the other hand, we see a totally different tendency, totally different trend, where actually when it comes to privacy, there's actual tightening, right? Where a lot of legislation is becoming more and more conservative. So we have these two opposite trends. And a lot, I just look at all the lawsuits, right? And that is definitely a bottleneck to this whole initiative, to the whole idea of total data and digital ecosystems. So it's a very, very difficult thing to hit that sweet spot and find the balance between the two. So that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Absolutely. A very important area. You touched upon the personal data and privacies. And let me just say that when it comes to personal and also non-personal data, industrial data, there's lots of data other than the humans. Let's not forget about that. And big tech companies, all the industrial companies, they have their own ecosystems. And speaking of big tech companies, similar to the United States, well, we have great examples in Russia. Let's take Yandex, for example, giant and a true big tech ecosystem. And with that, of course, I would like to address it to Alexander Krainov, because you represent Yandex. You're head of machine learning laboratory within Yandex. So I'm sure that you have something to say about using and reusing data. So as a representative of the big tech, tell me about it. So, I mean, the whole idea, the whole approach of data recycling, right? It's just how important it is for you, for your ecosystem, for Yandex. Just how important is this initiative? So this whole the EU approach, just how important is going to be for you as Yandex and for the whole economy? Well, the first thing I need to say that when you use word data, almost you use this something abstract. Well, data is not monolithic. And if you decompose it, it turns out that there's a certain percentage of data that should absolutely be reusable, and it's just a no-brainer. They should be absolutely open, easy to access. That's it, done. At the same time, there's data that's so sensitive but you need to think twice before you open it up. So speaking of Yandex, we have so many services. We have an ecosystem, and some of our services, such as search engine or maps, are very digital. Others, like taxis or food delivery, are very traditional. But even within our ecosystem, that doesn't flow, throughout Yandex, such as the fact that, where the person is traveling on a taxi, Yandex Taxi, doesn't affect the search engine, right? Because sometimes not all data should be interconnected. Certain types of personal data should be left personal, let's call it that way. At the same time, there's so much aggregated information, and that aggregated information will not affect a particular person, but at the same time will tremendously help, for example, our search engine or our maps and things like that, right? For example, when we provide our taxi services, we need aggregated data so that we can analyze traffic jams, flows, overall traffic intensity, and things like that. So there's a lot of predictive components that you can extract from aggregated data. So there's lots of solutions, lots of ideas, and lots of different types of data. And thank God, there's a very clear relationship here. And the relationship is that the more clear, the more precise, and the more safe the data is, then the more obvious it is that this data should be used, reused, that should be available for common use and in public access. I think it's a very good indication, by the way. If you can allow to put data in public, open space, that means that this data should definitely not be regulated, right? Because they're open space, right? If the data is open for reusable things, so then don't regulate it. That's it. So very interestingly enough, that in the European Union, they're not trying to tighten the regulation, but instead they're trying to actually enable the marketplaces, enable data transmission and data exchange. This is a very good initiative. I think a lot of opportunities here, for sure. And let me give you an example, something that we've all been seeing, the situation with the coronavirus. And so it happened, we didn't see it coming, but so it happened that during the pandemic, like never before, data exchange went up tremendously. And it wasn't necessarily through marketplaces. It's just that the companies and the government, to the extent that they could, would share their data like never before because of the COVID. For example, Yandex has produced the self-isolation index. We could track it on a daily basis, so we knew exactly who's at home and who's outside. During the COVID, it was very important. Or based on our data, we can actually build projections on the virus dynamic. And we shared it with the government, so they know exactly how many people are ill, how many people are in the hospital, how many people use ventilators and whatnot. So, and having a huge marketplace, we would also, every time you log into Yandex, the front page, you see the pandemic index. So we made everything public so that people know exactly what is happening with the COVID, etc., etc. So this is a great example of collaboration. Or one more example, let me give an idea. The government is opening up a lot of data. For example, you can actually, when you use public transport, you can easily know exactly when is your bus, right? And if you're standing on a bus stop, you log in through the app, you know exactly where exactly is your bus. Is there a traffic jam? Is the service okay, not okay? Should you wait for the bus, or should you take a tram maybe, or a subway? So a lot of these data becoming public, and they offer tremendous value. If you compare the pros and the cons, the pros definitely outweigh the cons, for sure. So in terms of conflicts, I don't even have it on the back of my mind. I don't see data sharing being problematic, but every time you start sharing data, you see multiple benefits. So the benefits by far outweigh any negative components here. And in terms of data privacy versus reusing the data, extracting profit, etc. So yes, we haven't yet struck the balance here, simply because it's all growth story. So we are not using data to enough extent. We're not exchanging data enough to even talk about who's going to benefit or who's not going to benefit. We need too much data. Yeah. So be careful what you wish for, so to say. Right. So let me give the floor to the actual government representative, which is the #1 government official when it comes to data exchange. And of course, we have deputy head of Roskomnadzor here, Miloš Wagner. Miloš, please, a question to you. So we've heard from the European side, and it's obvious that it's an expansion. It's an add-on to the current data. So there'll be more data. As far as Russia, of course, Russia has always been looking up to Europe as an example to follow, right? And Russia has joined multiple conventions and directives. So would you comment, please, as a regulator, this initiative, just how far off is it compared to Russia? How close is it to what Russia is thinking? Can it be copy-pasted and adopted into Russian space? Hello, everyone. Hello, Dmitry. Thank you for this intro and thank you for the opportunity. So, speaking of my contribution, and oh, by the way, a separate thanks for the, of course, the to Miloš. Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Shimon. Thank you for this information. So, and just to make sure, Roskomnadzor, this regulator, is not just about personal data oversight. No, we have lots of other powers, such as we providing permits, communication, media. So we have very wide powers. It's one of the key regulators in Russia. But when it comes to personal data, of course, we provide direct oversight over personal data. And we also make sure that the rights of individuals' rights are followed. And this came from the EU Convention 108. So, and this is our direct mandate. So we treat everything that we do via these direct mandates that we have. So based on what I've heard from the European side, my takeaway is that actually it's a very similar approach. If you compare EU approach and Russia approach, very, very similar when it comes to data, especially personal data. Very, very similar. And from what I understand, this initiative doesn't contradict the privacy, the confidentiality. The GDPR is still there, right? It doesn't cancel GDPR. And there's still control from the government in terms of the implementation. And we also heard it from Shimon that, so, I mean, the data should in the European Union, right? It's very, very important. So the data is used and reused and in the European Union. And just to answer Dmitry's point as to, well, I guess it's another regulation when it comes to personal data. I think it's a very exciting initiative for sure. And Russia will definitely adopt something similar. So, and what Victor was talking about and what I'm looking at the commentary section here and YouTube. Well, still, if we do it in Russia, there will be questions, of course. So when you open the data up from government, from public, for private, as part of data altruism, whatever the source of data, every time you opening up the data, the countries that have the best technology and infrastructure will benefit the most, right? And the countries that don't have such capabilities will probably benefit less. So, I mean, and when you make data anonymous or quasi-anonymous, you can always apply certain technologies. So you can take anonymous data and unhash it and turn it into personal. So, you know, there are a lot of technology that allows you to do that. And there's also a problem that we need to think about it. So it's a very interesting topic. And for myself, my question would be, well, clearly the regulation is still in the making. It has not yet taken effect, but will take effect in the future. So the European Union colleagues, what about third-party participation, such as the Russian Federation? Can't we join the whole process so that maybe we can somehow contribute when the legislation takes force, the relationship between the EU and Russia? Can we contribute to this development? Thank you. Well, thank you, Miloš, for the question. Well, I guess obviously it was a question to Shimon, right? So can Russia contribute? Let me again paraphrase it, Shimon, you can hear us, right? So these are very important items that came from Roskomnadzor. So the first one is the methodology of making data anonymous, right? And in Russia, we've been struggling with making data anonymous. It's a big challenge for Russia, the anonymity of data and using the right approach to making data anonymous. And the second one, the exchange, the contribution. So you many times said that this is an exchange of data within the European Union. Can you expand it and include Russia into it? And can Russia contribute it? Can you expand this? Maybe not now, maybe in the future somehow.
Hi. So indeed, data anonymization is, I think, a topic which is, well, hotly debated across the world, and there is no unique solution that Europe, for instance, could propose here, because it is not really about legislation, not really about something that the law could solve. It's more in the realm of technology and technological solutions. So we think we have a very robust rules when it comes to data protection. We have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which obviously in many cases makes it almost a condition for data to be usable, meaning that personal data, unless it's fully anonymized, can only be used under very strict conditions of, well, of course, consent and other possible legal basis that could apply in any given moment. But anonymization would really help us solve many of the bottlenecks that we currently observe. And this is why our approach in the EU is rather to try and solve it through technology. So we have a lot of funding foreseen for pushing the innovation and research into the technologies that could really guarantee the anonymization of personal data. Now, perhaps, as is very often the case, in technology, one solution basically can create a different kind of problem, or perhaps the same technology can be then used to de-anonymize data. This is possible, but in the current environment, we think there are ways of ensuring safety of data, and we have also in the Data Governance Act actually foreseen conditions for what we call bringing the algorithm to the data rather than data leaving a safe environment. We think this is also one of the possible new ways of treating sensitive data and exploiting its value in a safe manner, in a safe environment. And the second issue is how there are some rules in the Data Governance Act which tackle international data transfers. So in general, within Europe and on a also, let's say, wider scale, we think that data localizations restrictions are not the best way to approach the data economy, because of course it's a major limitation. Nevertheless, since we have put so much effort into creating, let's say, a safe environment for data within the boundaries of the European Union, we have rules in place that would enable transfers outside of Europe, of course, but on the condition that data is also safe there. So we have already this system put in place for personal data, and we intend to also roll it out for non-personal data, meaning that transfers outside of Europe are welcome, under the guarantee that the data will be treated with a similar degree of, let's say, protection when it comes to personal data protection, when it comes to trade secrets, when it comes to intellectual property rights, etc., which I think is a fair approach. So there is certainly a possibility for engaging countries outside of Europe, and in various ways. Of course, there are all sorts of treaties and conventions that could be updated, that could be developed to make sure that there is a common level, let's say, of security and insurance when it comes to data transfers across the borders outside of Europe.
Thank you very much, Shimon. Well, it was a very interesting point from Mr. Ambassador and from you as well. When you said that we're not only talking about personal or industrial data, but also government data, public data. And I think your final slide, this quote from the EU Commissioner on Internal Markets, because, well, data is absolutely essential for artificial intelligence development, right? And here in Russia, we have this opinion that artificial intelligence is about several specific companies like Yandex and other big tech, because they have, we also have Sberbank, which is like huge and has been investing billions into artificial intelligence. And Sberbank has AI events, global events. Sberbank is no longer a bank, it's basically so big. And recently, for example, AI Journey is an event that actually where Mr. Putin was actually personally present, and other presidents of other countries. It was a very, very big event. So, and that's why I would like to address this to Boris Rabinovich from Sberbank. Boris, if you're here with us. Yes, hello, yeah, I'm here. Okay, well, so question to you, Boris. Speaking of data volume, just how much data do we need to access to have this artificial intelligence truly develop? Because President Putin, in his presentation during the AI forum, said that we need to make sure the data is available for the sake of developing artificial intelligence. What kind of data volume are we talking about? Just how much data should be open and available to artificial intelligence? Tell me. Well, thank you for the question. I would say that, well, I actually, by and large, support this whole initiative about accessing data, this enriched data, and anonymous data, etc., right? I support all these initiatives. And just to answer your question, of course, the more the better. That's what it's all about artificial intelligence, right? The more the better. So, and there's no such thing as too much data. But then there's the other question. As a CDO of the bank, I need to also think about the quality of data and the data attributes. Then it's a different topic, but I totally support Marcus and Shimon, of course, and Victor and all other presenters, and Alexander as well. So it's true. And thank you for noting that alongside Yandex, there's also Sberbank. Yes, a big tech giant now, not just a bank. It's true. But let me talk about the access to data sets. Let me talk about this question and explain the position of Sberbank for the rest of the market. Well, obviously, there are several things that we need to solve, and we're not unique here. It's basically a similar issue because, well, every time you face these big data sets, the first one is purely economic. Because, well, if you can solve certain issues in a centralized way, that means that the cost of doing business will be definitely lower. Right? If you have data sets available through a single point of access, well, definitely that will enable new services, new products, and much lower costs. This is a huge overall benefit for the digital economy. And according to the World Bank data, because of that, we can actually add 1% to GDP, minimum to global GDP, just because of that. And if you do it in a centralized way, then we'll definitely benefit multiple stakeholders. But the question is then who and how will share these data sets? What are the rules? How do you protect the distribution of these data sets and whatnot, right? In terms of data governance, what are the rules and processes for data interchange, well, monetization of data, etc., etc. And as someone who's in charge of big data platform at Sberbank, I see this as also a very expensive exercise because you invest so much in data management, data audit, data storage, data handling. There's a long list of cost items that you need to invest in. And by centralizing generally available data in one place, because right now all this data is scattered all over the net, right? servers, databases, data centers, whatnot. There's so many different places where the data is being stored. If you can actually put it in one place so that anyone, an individual or a company, can go in and tap into this big giant data repository, that would be amazing. And then if you can apply some API, that would be just amazing. That would definitely tremendously reduce the cost of doing business. And in terms of the benefit for society, huge, of course, in healthcare, education, also the overall environment, smart cities and things like that. I mean, this will benefit society, bar none. And I can definitely see that. And using big data sets and big data during the pandemic, by the way, do you know that in Russia, in Moscow, we actually developed this new algorithm that enables us to actually diagnose or we call lung infections, because COVID is related to lung infections. So we, as Sberbank, the bank, provided this technology to all doctors in Russia. So we use artificial intelligence for the public good. And now all doctors in Russia use this technology that was developed by Sberbank, so that we can then diagnose, for instance, lung diseases and things like that. So see, that came out of COVID. But what's missing here, what's lacking, is, like I said, the legislation. It has to be properly governed and properly regulated. And to combine data and blend, I mean, big data is a nice word, but if you cannot enrich it, right, if you cannot match it, right, there's, I mean, big is not necessarily better, right? Big data by itself doesn't do not anything. You also need to be able to enrich data. So it's very, very important for us to actually not just waste time and money and effort, but to actually make sure that it benefits both us and the clients. Right? The idea is to know your client to the best extent you can. But for that to happen, we want to make sure that we don't necessarily work with the personal data, but with the derivative of the personal data, the anonymous data, because we don't necessarily need the personal data. We need, data that is tagged and has the right attributes. But unfortunately, the bottleneck of the Russian law is that it equates personal data to anonymous data. Anonymous data should not be equal to personal data, because if you see as a government anonymous data still as personal, then you limit our access to such data. So once the data become anonymous, it should be absolutely free access. And well, some say that by making the data anonymous, you should make them so anonymous that you cannot de-anonymize it back. So if you make it anonymous, make it truly anonymous. But again, it's a step-by-step process. It's a step-by-step thing. And I'm absolutely sure that through trials and errors, we can indeed make sure that it's a one-way thing, and you cannot take anonymous data and then personalize it back, right? So it's possible. I'm sure it's possible. And we're already doing this, and I'm sure that in Europe, companies are also doing this. Again, it's about creating that sandbox, as we call it, technology sandbox, where all participants, stakeholders, the government, the tech companies can operate. And for example, the Association of Big Data in Russia, and we have a representative of this association here. So they created this sandbox so that they can experiment and eventually arrive at the best possible solution. And as you know, as Sberbank and Yandex, we're all part of the Big Data Alliance. And the idea here is that we can indeed use this anonymous data to train our neural models, to train our big data sets, so that we can improve the quality of our modeling and provide new products and services to people. And I would say that for the Alliance, it's very important to actually combine data from multiple sources. Bigger, smaller data sets, so that we can solve specific issues for the general good, for the general public. And taking advantage of the opportunity, please, we need the support of the government here. And it's a very sensitive topic, I'm sure. And Yandex clients, Sberbank clients, government clients, I'm sure will absolutely benefit from solving this issue. And coming back to the data volume, the original question. Of course, we have artificial intelligence algorithms And they are already very precise. They're very good at predicting the situation, even with the existing data sets. But when we're talking about the full power of big data, and as Sberbank is a big data supplier, we have tremendous amount of data about pretty much all citizens of Russia, because we're everywhere. And of course, the more data we have, the more data we can combine, the more precise we will know about the needs of the clients, and the better will be the service, and the better will be the products that we provide. Thank you very much, Boris. Also taking into account the fact that you actually addressed the question to the government representative. I suppose that I will probably pass the floor to another representative. I'm talking about Roman Kuznetsov, of course, head of legal department from the Ministry of Digital Communication. And maybe you can answer this one for me. So, as I said in the very beginning, on top of the existing measures and directives, the GDPR and Privacy Acts and whatnot, so Europe is now thinking, this whole initiative is about that, about structuring the market of data and making sure that all stakeholders have quality ways to enable this seamless data interchange. You can call it the development policy in many ways. And considering that your ministry is no longer, and then the Ministry of of Communication and Information Technology, but also, well, you've changed your name. So are you ready as a ministry to tackle it? Or do you need to go to other ministries? Do you have enough capability to solve this issue inside your ministry? Because we need to find someone who has the capability to formulate these initiatives from the government side. Yes, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it, and thank you for the opportunity, of course, to present my topic here. I completely agree with what the ambassador said about the fair competition, of course, but data safety is also very important. And I would say that when it comes to a development of the country and the economy, of course, we need a big data, of course, we need all of that. And we're not going to limit it or create any bottlenecks or other obstacles. But at the same time, I want to make sure that the rights of the data owner, the data originator, is not violated in any way. I don't want data privacy to be sacrificed for something else. I want to make sure that so there's a balance between using the data and protecting the interests and the privacy of the one who donated the data. So when it comes to the European experience, the way I see it, it's an attempt to make personal data so safe by anonymizing it so that it doesn't violate privacy on the one hand, and on the other hand, provide economic benefit, right, for multiple stakeholders. And I think it's a big challenge. It's not easy to do because we actually don't have any solutions on the table in Russia that will kill these two birds with one stone. Right? We don't yet have that approach to making data so anonymous that they're absolutely safe for multiple recycling. And speaking of the data altruism and these intermediaries, they truly need to be like, the devil is in the detail, as they say. So our job is to make sure that the requirements in Russia are such that they can indeed walk the walk, so to say. And if they say that they're intermediaries, then they can truly follow their purpose. And like I said, anything you do, whatever you do, the safety of the original data and the individual, right, and the entity behind that is absolutely top priority. And yes, that's exactly what we're trying to tackle at the moment as a ministry, and I'm sure that we will succeed. Well, thank you, Roman. Well, in that case, if you don't mind, I want to come back to Shimon. We have an interesting question here from the audience, and would like to ask you this question. So, Shimon, in your mind, the companies, the big tech giants, the Googles of the world, could it be that they will eventually become the canaries in the coal mine, so to say? Can they become intermediaries? What is the, I mean, is it even possible that they will become these intermediaries? And is it a good solution? Because in Russia, we already have examples like Yandex, like Sberbank, and they want to be that way. So what about European Union?
Well, in theory, they could become such data intermediaries. So as long as they comply with the rules and the legislations that we have foreseen for the operation of such data intermediaries, they could become. Although they would need to structurally, organizationally separate the work of, let's say, the entity that would provide the services under the rules of the Data Governance Act from everything else that they do elsewhere. This is one of the main, I would say, conditions for maintaining neutrality of the data intermediary service and for avoiding any conflict of interest between the interests of the data holders and the interest of the entity that that is providing the intermediary service. So it could happen. Now, if they will want to go down that road, probably not, because they have so far, I would say, aggregated such amounts of data, and they have developed different processes that have become very efficient in organizing the data, in extracting value out of this data, that they would probably stick to what they know best. But you know, we never know. And as I said, I mean, the legislation and in general the data economy in Europe is open to any entity, as long as the entity will comply with the basic rule of governance in this case. But of course, other constraints such as respect of data protection legislation. Here, I can fully support the previous speaker that it is essential that whatever we do, in whichever way we innovate on data, we have to make sure that data protection is fully respected. And as we know, this has not always been the case with the big platforms. So here we see, I think there is a certain effect also on those platforms which, even if they are based outside of Europe, they tend to follow, I would say, the best example or the best practice. And we have seen that they have already modified in many ways their functioning. So I think there is, you know, some hope that not only we will see the emergence of alternative ways of data sharing, which maintain what we call this data sovereignty, meaning data control, the control of data subjects and the control of companies over their data when they share the data, but that even those big online platforms will gradually, you know, merge into those new models. But that's just guessing. We will see what happens. You know, the data economy, just like the digital economy, is so dynamic that we often say, you know, the winners of today may not necessarily be the winners of tomorrow.
Absolutely agree with you, Shimon. Thank you for being honest with us. And let me just say that we also have Association of Big Data of Russia. Yes, and we have Anna Serebryannikova. So Anna, maybe a question to you, the exact same question that I asked Shimon. So what do you think, who in, let's say, our environment can take up that role of being an intermediary? Who should it be? An independent company, some sort of association, somebody else? Just tell me. And the second question I have for you is, well, when it comes to government exchange, government data exchange, representative of Sberbank mentioned that, also the European Union representative, and Shimon mentioned that as well. Just to clarify, asking you, can this Russian intermediary can serve as the organizer of exchanging government data. And I'm talking about government versus government. Let me just take it on a big scale, right? Because we're talking about using intermediaries and channeling data from business to business and from business to government and from government to government. Can you enable that as an association? Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dmitry. It's a very interesting question. So let me think about it. Okay, let me do it one by one. Well, first of all, when it comes to our association of big data, the reason we were born is exactly what the European Commission was talking about. This is the whole reason of our existence. So from the very start, we are trying to develop that data market, the data space. And that means that we are focusing on the most important items on this market, such as making data anonymous. We talked about it. And maybe I will say a couple of more words about that. And aggregating data. Two big things: making data anonymous and aggregating data. Now, how come that the big market participants decided to build this association that I represent? What is the reason for having an association of data? Well, because they needed a forum where they can have trust. And they wanted infrastructure where we can actually experiment. They wanted the sandbox where we can run multiple experiments with depersonalized data, because all big market players, and it's okay, but they hoard their data, or they protect their data because they invested their time, their brain power, their money, right? So they've accumulated data, and data is a big asset for them, right? That's how they win. That's how they become big tech, right? So they cannot just give it away just like that. So in my case, so no personal data goes into our sandbox in this original form. So we use both technology and certain other techniques that make data enough depersonalized so they can be used for our experiments. So we said several times that from a technology or a standpoint, it's almost impossible to do this one-to-one ratio. So only when you combine technology and certain regulation, only then can you make data anonymous enough, right, to enough extent, so that the personal or sensitive data never leave the company or the government, and only properly anonymous data, you can call it like a synthetic derivative of this original data. Then that derivative comes to us, our sandbox. So, and that's exactly what we're working on at the moment. So we make, and of course, what we're lacking is a new legislation. So Russian participants know about it, and I'm not sure that European participants know about it, because that we are at the very, very beginning. At the very beginning, we would like more innovative legislation here and more initiatives here. So the issue of trust that Shimon was talking about it, and the European colleagues were talking about, is probably one of the cornerstones, and is the reason why they created these intermediaries, because it's all about trust, the lack of it, I would say. Because yes, big tech giants, of course, they can create this kind of intermediary component in them, but because of the competition, there will be limited access, whether you like it or not, because it runs counter to their DNA. You can almost say it like that, right? It's almost like you want to turn a wolf into a vegetarian. It's almost like becoming a transvestite in many ways. So, and that's why having our association and serving as an intermediary is the right way to go. So they don't have to butt heads and fight head to head. Like I said, there could be more of it, but the whole idea is the same, so that they can have trust, right? And that's why this independent intermediary is being created. Now, from the positive developments, apart from the sandbox for legislation and technology that we truly, truly believe in, because we need that sandbox for legislation and technology where we can run multiple experiments. The second part is the COVID situation. Because of the COVID, we actually changed our approach to medical data tremendously. I long ago said that the access to anonymous medical data will eventually become easy, and it was one of the most sensitive issues. But finally, the government said yes to using medical data for artificial intelligence, anonymous data. This is a breakthrough. I don't know why nobody's talking about it. That's a breakthrough that we need to do exactly the same for other sectors of economy, so that you can open up anonymous data for the artificial intelligence and for modeling. Because this is the holy grail, because this is the kind of data we need. Now, speaking of the government relationship, it's good that when it comes to access to government and public data is making progress, because we have the so-called digital profiles or the national data management systems and other projects. It's good that we have these initiatives, because there's so many companies that are now part of the digital profile system, so they can actually use government data, public data, for their own use. What they're missing is yet another point of our agenda, is the quality of such access. Yes, they have access, but what about the quality of such access, the so-called SLA, service level agreement? Because to really provide high quality services and products based on public data, partially in the commercial domain, you need to be partners, right? Businesses and government need to see each other as partners. And therefore, through service level agreement, you can create proper quality services so that people can go online and get that service excellence, get a truly high quality of product. So, and that's what we need to do more, of course, so that then we can create a breakthrough in terms of the quality of both products and services. And this work is on the way, and it doesn't violate data privacy, because it is done with full consent through a digital profile, because there's always a consent, and it is done on an aggregated basis, so it doesn't violate any privacy acts. So, and that's what we do. So in the past, we thought that the legislation that regulates personal data in Russia, the privacy legislation, is a major obstacle for the development of digital economy, but not anymore. So we see that through specific legislative actions, such as the new medical data initiative, right, and opening up medical data for artificial intelligence. So that means that we can flourish, we can develop, and what the European Union is doing. They still have GDPR intact, but on top of that, they have this new intermediaries, and it's great. It's great. So they've given new life to this whole area. It's a very smart idea. So, and they're very precise, they're very specific. So that's the best approach, I guess. That's the best approach to really have progress in this area. And by the way, the deeper we go, the less we fear, because you always fear the unknown. But the more you understand, because every time there's something new, it's like you're in a dark room and you're afraid of things. But when you light up the room, you see, oh, it's not that scary. All this data privacy, not that scary. So we do understand that, as we say in Russia, that appetite comes when you eat. So it's like a sword versus the shield. So that's like, I mean, the way we, for example, treat other areas. It's just a matter of time, of course. It comes with knowledge, education, and the same for control systems, certifications, threat analysis, and whatnot. So like I said, when it comes to anonymous data, there will be definitely more of it. And I'm not saying, I'm not sure I'm saying something new, but what's missing in Russia and what they already have in Europe is this voluntary data donation, right? Being data altruist. For example, I have medical data. I want to open it up. I want to volunteer, right? Of course, you need my consent, and this consent has to be informed. But if I give my consent, then I need a tool so that I can channel all this data and make it public. That's what we're missing in Russia. This donorship, this altruism. if we can tweak Russian legislation and enable that, so I can provide my data if I want to, this will definitely benefit the humankind. This will definitely improve environment, healthcare, many other things. So this will tremendously benefit the public good. And that's what we're missing in Russia. And we will receive so many new people that will say, yes, absolutely, I'm ready to share my data for the common good. This can be sensor data and whatnot, wearable device data, etc., etc., etc. So we can produce tremendous benefit if we can tweak legislation and enable that. So not necessarily for commercial use, not necessarily that. And by the way, representatives of the government, let me point it out that this is, by the way, the number one. So you need to have these data banks that are aggregated from the data that is provided voluntarily by people. So we need to enable it from a legislation standpoint. This would be a breakthrough. Again, whether you like it or not, there's no way you can hide from it. You will have to solve it. And that's why we're here. That's why we're here. So thank you, the organizers, for bringing us here. It's a very important job. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for your presentation. So, based on your presentation, can I ask you just a couple of questions to Shimon? So my first question would be mostly industry related. I think you mentioned that the medical data, right? You mentioned the medical data, that now the medical data are open, right? Of course, they're anonymous, but now finally the government allowed to actually use medical data in Russia. So what about you, Shimon? I mean, to which extent is it mandatory? I'm trying to figure out. Well, clearly, it's a voluntary initiative, right? For example, I would like to donate data. I understand that. It can be an individual or a company, but what about the government? Will government be obligated to donate data, or can they do it voluntarily? What about the government or the ministries, politicians? Will they be obligated to share the data, or is it a matter of, willpower? So will the governments, as part of this initiative, be obligated to share data, or is it voluntary for them? That's the first question. And the second one about this donorship, have you had any estimate just how many people in the European Union are actually willing to volunteer and to actually share data voluntarily?
Thank you for the question. So the first question is interesting. So in fact, we have separate approach according to the type of data that you were talking about. So for all the kind of information which is held in the public sector and which is not sensitive, so which is not covered by all these limitations related mostly probably to personal data protection, there is a full obligation to allow the reuse of such data sets. So, and actually in most cases for free or at a marginal cost of dissemination, meaning that this information, if it's already available in a digital form, should normally almost be available in a fully open manner at no cost. Now, when you talk about the information which until now has been used to a very little extent because it's covered by certain third-party rights or personal data protection, and therefore it's not legally or even technically easy to make it available to anyone. There, the Data Governance Act does not foresee an obligation to allow the reuse like it does with regard to, let's say, the standard public sector information. But what it does, it says, if you start reusing this data, if you want to make it available for research, innovation, etc., you have to do it under the rules laid down in this legislation. And this, for instance, includes principles such as non-discrimination. So you should not discriminate among the reusers. If you allow the reuse of this sensitive data to one company, you should use the same conditions for making it available to someone else. You cannot engage in what we call exclusive agreements, for instance, to choose a company that you prefer for whatever reason and monopolize the access to a given data set by this particular company. So such practices would be forbidden. So in one way, you can say it's a light touch approach to this particular issue. On the other hand, it aims to regulate the behavior of the public sector once it actually makes the data available. The other question was, could you please remind me?
Yeah, and the second question about the research in the EU, just how many people in the European Union are willing to actually voluntarily donate data?
Yes, well, this I would like to know myself. So we do not have such a specific number. We do not, we have not evaluated the overall number of people who would be willing to donate their data. I think this would also depend on the availability of a, let's say, trusted and secure mechanism to make it possible. So if I ask people now, there would be a different kind of reply than if I ask them in, let's say, 1 year and a half when the data governance regulation will be in place. But through public online consultations that we always need to conduct before we actually propose any new laws, we can see a lot of interest. So we had thousands, let's say, of replies coming from citizens, basically calling for such a regulation to be put in place. So I think it's a fairly widespread phenomenon, and I would even say that probably there are, even more people who would like to give some of their data away in a secure manner for a public interest good, then there would be for those who would like to start monetizing on this kind of information. Because we have to remember that in Europe, personal data protection is actually a fundamental right. It's one of the fundamental rights from the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Therefore, it really comes first. We really treat it in a way that it takes precedence over any other rights and obligations. So I think it's a fairly widespread feeling, and I would be very happy to give away my data for medical research, for instance, if I could.
Thank you very much, Shimon. And maybe I will join you and also become a volunteer. So the moment they enable us with the safe mechanism, no problem. I will definitely be able, not necessarily all of my data, but many of my data, I will definitely be ready to share and volunteer. So, and my next one goes to the Ministry of Economic Development. We have Vladislav Fedulov. Well, he had some difficulties, and that's why we have Vasily Gurkin, his colleague. And as a matter of fact, both Boris and Anna mentioned the word sandbox several times. And a sandbox is basically a laboratory mode where we can experiment with technology, legislation, etc. And sandbox is a term that we defined in our official program. And just coming back to who's going to be in charge of this whole economy thing. So the Ministry of Economic Development that you represent, of course, will definitely have a major contribution, right? For sure. Because the Ministry of Economic Development, well, you add one word and you become the Ministry for Digital Economy Development. So the question to you, sir, the kind of infrastructure that you've created so far, just how friendly is it to the sandboxes that Anna was talking about and Boris? Just how ready are we as the government to respond and to match the ambition of the business alongside the European initiative? Can we do similar things that the Europeans do? Well, thank you very much for that. And this is a very important topic, to be honest with you. And I absolutely agree with everything that's been said by the ambassador and Shimon and everyone in Russia here from big tech companies. I would say, well, let me take a step back. Because when it comes to the government data, I mean, we've been working so long, since 2013, on making sure that the government data become available, the so-called government data, open data initiative in Russia. So everything that has to do with opening data that is not sensitive, we've made a tremendous step forward, as you know. And we've been working on this for a long, long time. You know, we have open data portal called www.gov.ru. And we have tremendous amount of data available there. So not all, but a lot of data sets are open on this web portal. And different quality, of course, different quality. But the biggest problem from the government side is the sensitive data. So sensitive data is not necessarily something that should be completely open and public. And when it comes to providing full access to sensitive data, well, it's a different topic. It can be quite sensitive. And that's why we need additional regulation, so that we can do it maybe, well, in a safe manner, because there's a lot of sensitive data that also need to become shared and reused. So we need to build the right legislation to set the right conditions on how this data should be used and what are the requirements to the participants and the users of such data. So, and that's what we've been doing recently. So with this new regulation, we will be able to enable this big data sandbox. So that together, like I said, in this sandbox, we will definitely be able to run multiple experiments and see what the future state of things can be with, proper control. And then if the sandbox experiment is successful, then we can scale it up and use it all across Russia, across the board. That's it. Now, when it comes to the actual sandbox, we'll need to also test, of course, data control, particularly personal data, the quality of data anonymizing, and I would say also set out the right criteria where the quality of making data anonymous matches, well, the truly safe level. There are certain requirements to what a safe data is, should be. And the kind of requirements for both businesses and governments when they publish data that can be then used for artificial intelligence, other applications and things like that. Because, it seems like there's a lot of data, but the quality of this data very often doesn't match the developers' requirements. There are a lot of complaints from developers, IT developers, saying that, yes, there's data, but we cannot use it. And there will be probably intermediaries that will make sure that the published data can be converted in the right format so that they match the requirements of the final users, so that they can actually apply for their neural models, so the data clean up, right, making sure that the data matches the actual requirements of the data model owners. And on top of that, of course, the data owners will have to be participating and sharing in the revenue that being generated by the user of the data. So, and again, this is where the legal framework comes in, so that we can test it out as part of this sandbox, as we call it. That's pretty much it from me, I would say. I do hope that we can actually launch this mechanism, and I do hope that this legal/tech sandbox will help us create a perfect regulation when it comes to access of data, using data, monetizing data, so that both the sell and the buy side can win from using this data, so that we will see new services, new products, new apps, and we'll have a brand new data market that is scalable and that people can enjoy this ecosystem of services. Well, thank you. Thank you, Vasily. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we are very, very close to running out of time. I think we've run out of time, as a matter of fact. I see a lot of questions from YouTube. I'm sure this isn't the last time, of course, we're meeting. And there will be more, of course, just another, in a set of meetings, there'll be definitely more. So if you had your questions, well, answered, of course, there will be more. And you're always welcome, by the way. You're always welcome because people are very, very excited about it. So let's see, big thanks to the speakers today. Thank you for being with us. Very exciting initiative. And from the European side and from the Russian side, I'm sure it's mutually exciting because Europe also wants to know what Russia is cooking, so to say. Not just the Russia are looking at Europe, but I guess it's both. It's reciprocal, right? And some really cool ideas about the data intermediaries and data altruism, something that Russia definitely needs more of. So thank you guys for being with us today, and thank you, the expert. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Shimon, for your contribution in your report, and everybody else. And I'll see you again. Thank you, and bye-bye. That's all the time we have.